Just over 1 week into Donald Trump's war in Iran, here's where things stand. 8 U.S. service members have died. The White House did not rule out a draft. We face what the Wall Street Journal calls the worst energy crisis since the 1970s, and the Iranian regime has replaced one brutal dictator with that brutal dictator's son. The war continues to intensify and escalate, with apocalyptic scenes of destruction unfolding in Tehran over the weekend. So far across the Middle East, almost 2,000 people have been killed, including at least 260 children. The Pentagon announced the loss of a 7th service member over the weekend in an attack in Saudi Arabia. He was identified earlier today as 26-year-old Sergeant Benjamin Pennington. He was from Kentucky. An 8th in Kuwait died in a non-combat medical emergency. He was identified as 46-year-old Major Sorfly Davies from New York. The death toll could continue to rise if more U.S. ground troops are sent to Iran. NBC News is reporting that Donald Trump privately expressed serious interest in boots on the ground. According to that reporting, Trump's, quote, interest in deploying ground troops has not focused on a large-scale ground invasion of Iran, but rather on the idea of a small contingent of U.S. troops that would be used for specific strategic purposes, end quote. The economic fallout from the first week has been swift and has already proven to be dire. Wall Street Journal reports this, quote, the most severe shock to energy markets since the 1970s is cascading through the world economy. The disruption quickly fed into higher gasoline and diesel prices at the pump and higher mortgage rates and borrowing costs for the U.S. government, endangering Donald Trump's economic priorities. Oil prices are soaring, reaching more than $100 a barrel for period today. It's the first time that has happened in almost 4 years. And it is thanks to the fact that the war has essentially grounded the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz to a halt. In response to that, Donald Trump told Fox News yesterday this, quote, these ships should go through the Strait of Hormuz and show some guts. There's nothing to be afraid of, end quote. Here's how Trump administration officials are trying to explain away the startling jump in oil prices.
And the other side here is that once this is over, then oil prices are going to be sustainably lower and in a safer position for years, if not decades, to come.
Yes, we have a temporary period of elevated energy prices, but it will not be long. In the worst case, this is weeks. This is not months. And it leads to a much better place. What you're seeing is emotional reactions and fear that this is a long-term war. This is not a long-term war. But it's a temporary movement.
With respect to what's happening with gas prices right now, this is a short-term disruption for the long-term gain of taking out the rogue Iranian terrorist regime.
That message was echoed by Donald Trump, who posted this, quote, short-term oil prices is a very small price to pay for USA and world safety and peace. Switching to all caps, only fools would think differently, exclamation point. The promise of a long-term gain, though, runs into major problems. First, the Iranian regime shows no signs of backing down. Mujtaba Khamenei is the son of the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He was chosen to be the new supreme leader, cementing the hardline theocratic rule in the country. Officials are worried that Trump's war has opened a Pandora's box with no clear endgame. New York Times reports this, quote, interviews with dozens of officials in the United States, Israel, Iran, and across the Middle East suggest that while American and Israeli military capabilities have proven to be overwhelming during the war's first 7 days, the violence that has metastasized across the region could yield all manner of fraught outcomes. That is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. New York Times diplomatic correspondent Michael Crowley's here. Also joining us, former director of the CIA. Our senior national security and intelligence analyst, John Brennan, is back. And with me at the table, executive editor and New York bureau chief for The Economist, Charlotte Howard, is here. Let me ask you to start with what you could not make up a more devastating sort of splash of economic headlines here in this country. Take me through the economic picture today.
Well, in the past few days, you've had, as you say, a pretty grim picture emerge, both with a jobs report that was much worse than people expected, a loss of 92,000 jobs in February, and then this startling continued rise in the oil price over the weekend. And what's so interesting about this, both in the short term and taking the bigger picture, is that Donald Trump's view on Iran was really forged in the 1970s and 1980s. You can go back to interviews with him there where he was very outspoken about the humiliation that America faced as a result of the Iran hostage crisis, as well as the oil pressure that came from price shocks in the 1970s. And here you have him, in some ways, in vindicating that supposed humiliation of the 1970s, replicating some of those economic conditions. You have high oil prices. You have real threats to the broader economy that could lead to that stagflationary picture. So, the thing that is most in Donald Trump's control to bring oil prices down is to end this war very quickly as possible. The idea that tankers should show guts it is sort of an interesting question of framing this as moral courage when the ships will just get blown up, right? That's not why they're going through the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, the gas doesn't make it to the pumps if they get blown up either.
Exactly. So it's sort of an illogical framing in terms of toughness, what is a security and economic decision. Mm-hmm. So I think that, Americans notice, of course, right, if the prices go up at the pump. So there's a real political pressure here, I think, on him now to do what he can to lower those prices again.
What's amazing is he gives the State of the Union on a Tuesday. He launches the war late Friday, early Saturday, and his only economic indicator that he's boasting about in that speech is gas prices. Do you think he was unaware of what are the markets responding to? Either that he was unaware that he would launch the strike or unaware what the impact of oil would be?
I sort of gave up a long time ago trying to understand Donald Trump's inner logic. Yeah. I don't think it leads us very far, but I do think what you can say is that he's offered no coherent explanation to the American people of precisely why now, nor has he offered a plan for a more stable Iran, nor has he offered a really compelling economic answer to, as we just heard, right, have guts. People who think this is going to go on are fools. There's this kind of moral condemnation that has nothing to do with policy. And so I think politically he's really running on the idea that vibes are going to carry him through. Vibes, i.e. we're being strong. And this sort of display of American strength is the thing that will give people confidence. And I think you're seeing in the markets right now that is not a compelling answer.
Director Brennan, your read of this moment.
It's a difficult read, that's for sure. And I certainly agree with what Charlotte is saying, that this is something that I think is going to go on for some time. And I think it just demonstrates that Donald Trump, ever since he assumed the presidency the second time, he's been very tactical. All of his steps don't take into account the second, third, and fourth order effects, whether it's tariffs or whether it's the deployment of ICE or whether it's a military operation in Iran. I think he just looks, what's my next move? And he doesn't think about, and obviously he doesn't take into account then the intelligence assessment that was given to him and to the other seniors that the military operation was unlikely to topple the regime. And so I think he's trying to figure out exactly the next steps. He's not ruling anything out because he very well may decide to put U.S. troops on the ground to carry out some type of operation. But these are the things that should have been thought about through before the operation took place. There was no coordination at the very beginning in terms of either consistent messaging on the rationale and objectives, and as well as other issues such as, making sure that there's going to be evacuation capabilities in place in the Gulf for U.S. citizens. And so there are a number of things that just make me believe more and more that he is taking things not just one day at a time, but almost 1 hour at a time. And he's going to go with his gut, again, irrespective of what the strategic implications are down the road.
How has Iran been able to hit American military targets in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia and other places? I mean, some targets for them are obvious places that anybody would be able to pick off a map, places like air bases or even U.S. embassies or consulates. But for all the damage that has been done to Iran's offensive capabilities in this war thus far, Iran has somehow also been able to hit things like, reportedly, a CIA facility in Riyadh and a naval command and control facility in Bahrain and U.S. radar facilities that are not clearly marked on any map and not obvious locations for anybody. How has Iran been able to find targets like that so they could aim their missiles and their drones at American facilities like that with such specificity? Well, the Washington Post and the Associated Press and us here at MS Now have all now reported that Iran has been getting help in targeting American personnel and military facilities, help from a sophisticated military ally in targeting U.S. personnel and U.S. military capabilities all over the Middle East. The Washington Post's report on this was first, and they explained it bluntly and clearly. Quote, Russia is providing Iran with targeting information to attack American forces in the Middle East. The assistance signals that the rapidly expanding conflict now features one of America's chief nuclear-armed competitors with exquisite intelligence capabilities. Quote, Iran possesses only a handful of military-grade satellites and no satellite constellation of its own, which would make imagery provided by Russia much more Russia and its much more advanced space capabilities highly valuable to the Iranians. So again, this was first reported by the Washington Post, this reporting then corroborated by the Associated Press and by us here at MS Now. The upshot is that Russia is helping Iran. Russia specifically is giving them targeting information, giving them very specific locations, using their own intelligence capabilities to give the Iranians very specific locations so they know where to attack American troops to try to kill them and where to attack American facilities in the Middle East. Russia is giving Iran that information. What should the United States do about that? Well, under the leadership of Donald Trump, the United States has decided that under these circumstances, what our response is going to be is that we're going to ease sanctions on Russia. Ease sanctions on Russia. Trump has moved to give Russia relief from sanctions. Trump has moved specifically to let Russia sell more of its oil and gas, get around sanctions, restrictions that might have prevented them from doing that before. I mean, Russia is allies with Iran, right? Russia issued a statement of congratulations when Iran chose Khomeini's son to replace him as the country's supreme leader. Congratulations, Junior. Enjoy your Ayatollahship. He's a close relation, a close connection to the radical and powerful Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Putin sends his personal congratulations. But, you know, Russia, as much as they might not want to see their ally put in difficult straits, Russia financially is actually really enjoying this moment. Because what does Russia have to offer the world? What does Russia have to offer the world economy? I mean, if you don't count vodka and potash, Russia basically has two industries, two things to offer the world: oil and war. And they're using their war-making abilities, their intelligence and satellite capabilities to help Iran kill Americans, to help Iran target and kill Americans in the Middle East. Also, on the war-making front, Russia is obviously enjoying seeing the United States burn up lots and lots and lots of missiles and interceptor munitions in the Middle East. So we'll be less happy and less able to provide those same types of weapons to Ukraine to fight against Russia. So on the war-fighting side of things for Russia, this is great for them. This is a win-win. And meanwhile, Russia's other industry, oil and gas, is as happy as it's been in a long time because of the huge spike in oil and gas prices all over the world, as Russia's oil and gas competitors in the Persian Gulf all basically get knocked offline. Right? If Russia can just sell their oil and gas, if they can be allowed to get their oil and gas to market, well, Russia's going to be rich again, which they desperately need, given how they've spent themselves into oblivion in their endless, pointless Ukraine war. And so we now simultaneously have the U.S. intelligence reports that Russia is helping Iran target American personnel and military facilities to kill Americans in the Middle East, and the news that Trump is cutting sanctions on Russia to ensure they can sell practically all the oil and gas they want and refill their financial coffers as a country. And so what exactly happened today when Trump reportedly called a CBS News reporter and said, the war's pretty much over? And then Trump called a bizarre and incoherent press conference at one of his golf resorts where he said, no, it's not pretty much over. Where did you hear that? Who told you that fake news? In the middle of that swirling dust devil of nonsense and reversal and double reversal and incoherence and non sequitur from the President of the United States, what happened in the middle of all that today? Well, according to the Kremlin, in the middle of all that, President Donald Trump called Vladimir Putin and talked to him for an hour. And we only learned about that phone call because the Kremlin told us about it. The White House didn't announce it. The Kremlin did. Did the White House even know Trump was doing that before the Kremlin told everybody it had happened? Did Trump just call Putin from his flip phone? Was it while he was playing golf? Was it even in the White House calendar that today was the day Trump was supposed to check in with his boss? Gulf War III continues. Gulf War I was because Iraq invaded Kuwait and we wanted to make them uninvade Kuwait. Gulf War II was because the George W. Bush administration wanted somewhere else to invade besides Afghanistan, so they made up a fantasy about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction when they didn't. Gulf War III is now, and Donald Trump started it, but for Gulf War III, there is still no coherent explanation from the president or the White House as to what exactly this is all for. Not even an obviously pretextual false reason like we had from George W. Bush. The president did unveil a new purported justification for the war today in his rambling press conference at his golf thing. He said, quote, "We're doing this for the other parts of the world." We're doing this for the other parts of the world. It's actually hard to argue with that one. That one might actually be true. The Wall Street Journal is now describing this as the most severe energy crisis since the 1970s. CNBC calls it the biggest oil supply disruption in history. Because there is no way to safely move it to market, Saudi Arabia has now cut its production of oil. Iraq's production of oil is down to less than 1/3 what it was before Trump started this war. In Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain, major energy companies have declared force majeure, which basically means they're saying, hey, you know, act of God, outside our control. We can no longer be held to any contracts we previously signed, as they all radically scale down their oil and gas production. And it's not only fuel, it's also food. Huge amounts of fertilizer pass through the Strait of Hormuz, fertilizer bound for ports all over the world, for crops all over the world, for foodstuffs all over the world. Raw materials related to the petroleum industry also being choked off. A plastics plant north of Tokyo started to scale down production on Friday because they can't get the raw materials they use in that production process because they're petroleum-based products. It's also aluminum and other commodities like that as facilities like smelters shut down for lack of fuel. The nation of Bangladesh just closed its universities because they need to conserve energy. They need to conserve electricity used by the universities, and they need to reduce the need for people to drive anywhere. Whole regions in the Philippines, including the capital city of Manila, just forced employers to institute a 4-day work week instead of a 5-day work week, specifically to try to save energy. Gas stations in Vietnam have started to run out of fuel. They've started to put up sold out signs all over Hanoi. The New York Times reports that Pakistan's strategy is to hike gas prices so people hopefully stop driving, and they're hoping that will be a protective measure to try to preserve both the supply and the price of diesel for Pakistan's trucks and buses. Okay, maybe that'll work for some time. Maybe some of that will work for some time. But why did all this happen? What was all this for?
We're doing this for the other parts of the world.
We're doing this for the other parts of the world. We're doing this for the other parts of the world. I'm sure they're delighted with that.
A newly surfaced document published in the DOJ's Epstein database reveals that an inmate once told the FBI that he overheard prison guards talking about covering up Epstein's death on the morning the sex offender died. The document includes 5 handwritten pages of notes from the unidentified inmate's FBI interview. And while unsubstantiated, the details are likely to raise more questions about Epstein's death, which was officially ruled a suicide. Joining us now, Julie K. Brown, investigative reporter for the Miami Herald. It's good to see you again, Julie. The inmate claimed that the whole wing, as I understand it, overheard this exchange among guards. Tell us what the notes from the FBI say.
Well, this particular inmate said that he woke up to the commotion of them discovering that something was wrong, in the SHU, which is the special housing unit for people like Epstein who are supposed to be watched more carefully. And in this particular case, he heard the yelling and the screaming, and of course it roused him up. And he told the FBI that he heard them say something to the effect of, "You dudes, you killed this dude, you killed him." And then another female guard saying, "Well, we don't have to worry about this because we're going to cover it up, and my guys are going to have an alibi," or words to that effect. And so, this raises questions about what actually happened on that night, and for good reason. There's been a lot of errors we know now there were a lot of errors made that night. And if you really look at the whole picture and all the problems that they had, I think that it's worthy to take a look at this inmate's statement, even though it was uncorroborated.
So I know that you tried to reach the lawyer for the female guard who was working. MS Now has tried to reach her lawyer. But what else do we know about her and for that matter, the others who were on duty that day?
Well, she was a relatively new correctional officer, as I understand it. And the other thing that came out over the weekend was the New York Post was the first to discover, and I also found the documents myself that showed that the DOC investigators, the DOJ investigators, actually did some work on her finances, got her banking statements, and you could see them in the files, and it shows that she had quite a number of cash deposits into her bank account. So that's suspicious. And she apparently searched for Epstein's name just 40 minutes before his body was found. So, there's all these pieces that don't make sense and have never made sense, going back to the July 23rd when they found him laying on the floor of a cell. And his first words when he regained consciousness was, "My cellmate tried to kill me." He never said that he tried to commit suicide. In fact, all the psychological reports say that he felt that he had a good case, that he was hiring lawyers, that he had a great life. There's no indication at all that he was suicidal in these psychological evaluations. So one has to wonder why they didn't investigate and seem to, I guess, believe his cellmate who told him that Epstein tried to commit suicide. His cellmate was a quadruple killer, by the way, and they believed him when he said that Epstein tried to commit suicide, even though Epstein said that wasn't the case.
Let me make sure that I have this right as well, that when you talk about these cash deposits that were made by this guard, they were for, as I understand it, thousands of dollars, and Epstein's former cellmate also told prison officials that he did tell Epstein he'd be safer if he paid inmates and guards for protection.
Yeah, this was a common thing that was happening at that prison. They did some subsequent investigation, and there were a lot of payments that were being made. There were a lot of cell phones. They did these through Cash Apps. This particular guard, by the way, had a lot of money coming in from Cash Apps as well. Some of these deposits, by the way, predated Epstein even coming into the prison. So it might be an indication that there was already a system in place for these extortion or these payments, protection payments, were common in that prison. But she did have one $5,000 cash deposit on July 30th, which was just after Epstein's alleged suicide attempt and just before his actual death. So it was right in the middle of that time she deposited $5,000 cash into her account.
As you point out, it's going to raise a lot more questions as this story continues. Julie K. Brown, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Well, Donald Trump is demanding something he has never seen. Donald Trump is demanding something no president in his lifetime has ever achieved: unconditional surrender. On Friday morning at 8:50 a.m., Donald Trump demanded Iran's unconditional surrender in a social media post. The last time the United States of America accepted an unconditional surrender, it took an atomic bomb to get it. In fact, 2 of them. After President Harry Truman became the first and only person in world history to use nuclear weapons against Japan, first in Hiroshima and 3 days later in Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender. Harry Truman had already accepted Germany's unconditional surrender in World War II 3 months earlier. No American president has demanded or accepted an unconditional surrender at the end of an American war since the year before Donald Trump was born, 81 years ago, at the end of World War II. Anyone who has witnessed a war during Donald Trump's lifetime knows that the unconditional surrender of Iran is impossible. Everyone on Wall Street knew that over the weekend when markets began to adjust negatively to an anticipated long-term Trump war in pursuit of the impossible: unconditional surrender. And so, of course, oil prices skyrocketed, the stock market crashed, and Donald Trump today offered his unconditional surrender. Donald Trump is the first American wartime president ruled by the stock market and the oil market. In a phone call with the CBS News reporter today, Donald Trump said, "I think the war is very complete." He said that during stock market trading in the hope of preventing a collapse. Donald Trump didn't mention unconditional surrender again today. And because it was Donald Trump who said unconditional surrender on Friday morning, we knew there was no chance of even Donald Trump holding on to the nonsensical demand of unconditional surrender. When President Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced publicly during World War II that the only peace terms that the United States of America would accept from Germany and Japan was unconditional surrender, the world knew that Franklin Roosevelt meant those 2 words, and everyone in the world, other than the German and Japanese regimes, knew that they could trust those presidential words as fact, as a prediction of what exactly was going to happen. The world knew from that moment on how World War II was going to end. They didn't know how long it was going to last, but they knew World War II was going to end in unconditional surrender because the President of the United States said so. And now the world knows the words of the current President of the United States have no meaning at all. 31 hours after Donald Trump demanded unconditional surrender, in another social media post, Donald Trump said, "We've already won!" exclamation point. Donald Trump doesn't even pay attention to the words of Donald Trump. Unconditional surrender Friday morning. We've already won Saturday afternoon. No unconditional surrender. As oil prices were skyrocketing over the weekend, Donald Trump said that higher oil prices were, quote, "a very small price to pay for USA." Well, it is certainly a smaller price to pay than the lives of the members of the American military that have been lost in Donald Trump's first days of Donald Trump's war. Donald Trump made no attempt to look presidential, since he doesn't actually know what that looks like, when he attended the dignified transfer of the bodies of the first 6 soldiers killed in his war. And he didn't remember those soldiers the next day when he wrote about what he called, quote, "a very small price to pay for USA." Before stepping up to the microphone at his golf resort today, Donald Trump made phone calls to individual members of the media in a desperate attempt to communicate something positive to the stock market, the real bosses of Donald Trump's war. One of those calls was to Fox's Brian Kilmeade, who quoted Donald Trump on Fox and Friends this morning, telling him, quote, "These ships should go through the Strait of Hormuz and show some guts. There's nothing to be afraid of. Show some guts." 20% of the world's oil shipments pass through the Strait of Hormuz, which has now become far too dangerous for safe passage. Shipping traffic has dropped by at least 90% in the strait or more. And Donald Trump's solution to that is for everyone on those oil tankers to just be brave, like him. Donald Trump wants the captains and crews of those ships to be brave and put themselves in the line of fire, put themselves in harm's way. Just call their families at home around the world and tell them, wish me luck. We are bravely going through the strait today because Donald Trump told us to show some guts. Donald Trump wants the non-combatants on commercial vessels to do something that no one in the Trump clan has ever done. Enter a war zone. Show some guts. How about 19-year-old Barron Trump, who is turning 20 in 11 days? As I reported on this program last week, all four of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's sons served in the military in World War II, while their father served as commander-in-chief until his death in office weeks before Germany's unconditional surrender. There was nothing more loathsome in the United States during World War II than war profiteering. Harry Truman became president of the United States because of his crusade against war profiteering. Senator Harry Truman studied war contracts more than any other senator, searching for illegitimate profiteering. He eventually became the chairman of a special Senate committee to investigate war profiteering. Senator Truman's investigations were at first a minor irritant to President Franklin Roosevelt, who was worried about anything that might inhibit America's industrial giants like the auto industry, which was then converting their factories for the manufacture of aircraft and tanks. But soon President Roosevelt came to appreciate Senator Truman's policing of the war contracts and Senator Truman's condemnations of any war profiteers that his investigations exposed. Imagine Donald Trump appreciating congressional investigations of potential corruption in the war contracts that he awards, he personally awards, he personally interferes with and delivers to the companies he wants to deliver those awards to. Franklin Roosevelt actually appreciated Harry Truman's investigations and condemnations of war profiteering so much that President Roosevelt chose Harry Truman to run with him as his vice presidential nominee as President Roosevelt ran for his final re-election campaign during World War II. Harry Truman then became president after President Roosevelt died in office. Harry Truman would hate what the Wall Street Journal is now reporting about Donald Trump and his sons. The Wall Street Journal reports Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr., the president's sons, are backing a new drone company that is vying to meet fresh demand from the Pentagon and fill a hole left by the administration's ban on new Chinese drones in the U.S. Power Us, a drone roll-up company based in West Palm Beach, Florida, is merging with a publicly traded golf course holding company backed by the Trumps. Power Us executives said investors in the deal include one of the Trumps' investment vehicles, American Ventures, and Unusual Machines, a drone components company where Donald Trump Jr. is a shareholder and advisory board member. The deal brings deeper involvement by the Trump family into a multi-billion-dollar sector that has new opportunities for growth following changes imposed by the Trump administration. Those include the Pentagon's emphasis on large-scale, rapid adoption of small drones. When Donald Trump started his war, he called it a war. He called it a war multiple times, and that is what it is. Donald Trump's Secretary of Defense also called it a war when the war began, which he especially loved doing since he falsely calls himself the Secretary of War. But now that Donald Trump realizes that Americans don't like war and maybe being reminded that he campaigned against war when he was running for president, Donald Trump is twisting the language to avoid the word war.
I mean, this was an excursion that a lot of people wouldn't have done.
An excursion. That's his latest description of his war today. An excursion. Donald Trump finds new ways to dishonor the war dead. A silly hat, and now an excursion. It's one thing to die in a war whose objective the president cannot explain. Americans have done that before and have done it since Vietnam. But to die in an excursion, to call it an excursion, before the families have even had the funerals, to struggle to find language that demeans those soldiers' sacrifice in service to his desperate political needs is a uniquely Trumpian moment in the American presidency. Tonight, there was another dignified transfer at Dover Air Force Base for Army Sergeant Benjamin Pennington, 26 years old, of Glendale, Kentucky. Donald Trump wasn't there. Donald Trump did not attend. But he did attend a fundraiser for House Speaker Mike Johnson today in Florida at Donald Trump's golf resort there. And if you're paging through the history books trying to find the president who went to a political fundraiser at a golf club on the 10th day of a war, you can stop right now. Only the guy who said, show some guts, there's nothing to be afraid of, would show his guts by going to a fundraiser instead of the second dignified transfer of his war of choosing.
Laura, is the White House listening to these Americans? And how much pressure are they getting from countries outside of the U.S., our foreign allies, to outline objectives in this war as it roils global markets?
Well, right now, the president and those in the White House are clearly standing by these actions, by the strikes, despite the fact that polling, as you note, Anna, as well as those comments that we're hearing from voters, they're not necessarily behind this war. They're not behind these actions. They already were feeling pain in a number of areas, not just at the gas pump. But when it comes to also our allies, they want answers as well. They want to know exactly what the objectives are. And broadly, the administration has outlined some objectives like destroying the Navy, wanting to ensure that the ballistic missile capability of Iran is wiped out. But again, there still aren't enough answers, whether there are people here at home hearing them or our allies. And you've seen some of that play out over the last week, where UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer had initially said that UK bases were not going to be able to be used by the US. They ultimately were, but President Trump was not happy with this back and forth with the UK, saying that if allies didn't want to join the U.S. from the beginning as they did these strikes, then they wouldn't necessarily need their help. There's also been tensions with Spain, where Spain did not want to allow U.S. planes to be landing in bases there as well. But this is something that we're seeing play out as a number of European allies want more answers from the administration, Anna.
Josh, over the weekend, Israel targeted Iran's oil facilities for the first time in this war. Those oil facilities are critical infrastructure for the region. How are we seeing the ripple effects? What are the potential ramifications?
Well, the ramifications, Anna, are enormous for the region and, in fact, for the world as oil prices, as we've been talking about, continue to skyrocket. In fact, none other than Lindsey Graham, the a staunch supporter of Israel and of President Trump, tweeted at the Israeli government, basically pleading with them to show some restraint, be cautious, he said, about what targets you select. So he, of course, framed it in the terms of trying to preserve Iranian infrastructure for when the people might be able to take over their government. But of course, there's a pragmatic reason here as well, because just in the last 24 hours, it's clearly become deeply escalatory in this region. Iran now targeting oil facilities in Bahrain, here in the UAE, and in Saudi Arabia, and all of this with this oil price crisis continuing to mount. So the escalation really cannot be overstated. Anna.
Bobby, of course, the U.S. hasn't presented any kind of timeline for this war, nor has Israel. How much do you think the oil situation is increasing pressure on President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu to do so?
Well, as the president has said, this is a temporary thing. He's argued that this is a price worth paying. We'll see as the week sort of plays out, as these prices continue to rise, and they're almost certain to continue to rise, whether American taxpayers support this idea that this is a price worth paying. We saw a few clips at the top of the segment suggesting that they do not. And the president's approval ratings are not moving at all. I have not seen this happen in my lifetime, where America has gone to a war, and there has been no rallying to the flag by the American people. Even wars that eventually proved to be highly unpopular at the start of those wars, the Iraq War, which I covered extensively, at the start of the war, the support for the president, Bush Jr. then, was enormous. There was a lot of support. Bush Jr. was able to get an international coalition, the Coalition of the Willing, who went in alongside the United States. There were Iraqi opposition groups that were supporting the effort. It was long planned, arguably well planned, but nobody planned for the day after. In this case, there does not seem to have been any planning for the day of the conflict, never mind the day after. And none of this sort of bodes well for how it's going to go. As I said, we've had reports from the White House suggesting the president is surprised by how the Iranians have held up and held out and continue to attack. He should not be surprised. This is not a surprise to anyone who's been paying any attention to the region. At least his advisors should have been very clear with him, suggesting, if you go into this war, this is what's going to happen. The Iranians are going to close the Straits of Hormuz. Nearly 20% of the world's oil supply travel through those straits. The Iranians are going to attack oil installations, not just in the immediate neighborhood countries, but one country over. And that's going to raise the price of oil. And it's going to go to three figures and continue to rise until such time the fighting stops. The president really shouldn't be surprised, and we should not be experiencing this shock of oil prices.
Would you expect Iran eventually to blink first?
Well, the new leader the Iranians have chosen, Mojtaba Khamenei, his father and wife were just killed 3 or 4, 5 days ago. That does not suggest that he's going to give up anytime soon. He's got a personal grudge in addition to the sort of institutional and ideological grudge. He's a hardliner. He's the hardest of hardliners. This is not the sort of person who you would expect to stand down. And there's nothing so far to suggest that the Iranian regime is suing for peace. There have been some apologies that have been made to some of the neighboring countries, but those apologies don't really hold up because they've continued to attack those neighboring countries. So the regime is certainly weakened when you take out the top leader, and not just one leader, but 40 of the top leadership in one blow. That's going to weaken the regime. It has been weakened. But there's nothing to suggest that weakening is the same thing as defeating. This is this is not a dictatorship in the way that we've seen in other countries. This is not a matter of removing one man from the top. There are institutions, there are redundancies built into these institutions. If one man is taken out, there's another. Mm-hmm. If that person's taken out, there's another, and another. There's a clear succession plan. I would not, again, based on what we've seen in previous conflicts in the Middle East, I would not be betting my house against the idea that the Iranians are going to blink anytime soon.
Of course, Laura, the president called Mojtaba Khamenei an unacceptable choice. Any sense of what the White House is prepared to do about it?
That's right, Anna. He also called him a lightweight. But when it comes to what exactly the president or the administration wants to do, again, they speak in generalities. They give kind of vague statements. The president saying that ultimately he wants to be a part of this decision. He wanted to be a part of who would become the next supreme leader, saying that the person would have to have his approval. And he also said that if they don't have his approval, then, he doesn't necessarily want to have to go back into Iran or continue the military action. But that's kind of the general answers we've gotten from the president, which is if it is someone he doesn't like, then he may be willing to have this military action continue to be ongoing and to potentially take out any subsequent leader. Again, the president compares this a lot to Venezuela, saying that it doesn't necessarily have to be a regime change, but that he wants someone in there who he approves of and who he likes, Anna.
Josh, I know there's been a steady barrage of missiles and drones targeting the same area you're in. And just this morning, we learned NATO defenses intercepted a second ballistic missile that was headed toward Turkey. How much is the scale and just creep of this war really intensifying?
Yeah, Anna, that really raises the stakes, right? A NATO member, of course, that brings in the prospect of European nations being pulled into this thing, NATO being pulled into this thing. But really across the Gulf nations, which had been trying to stay on the sidelines, are incandescent with rage about what has been happening over the last week. It's just been a relentless barrage of lethality in the air over their nations from Iran. There might possibly be good news that today, for the first day, UAE reported that it saw only 18 attack drones, intercepting 17 of them every day for the last several days. That number has been well over 100. How do you read that? Is that maybe scaling back? Is it just a fluke for one day? I guess we'll find out tomorrow. But obviously, this region, to what you said earlier, Anna, is just hoping someone blinks before more of these countries get more heavily involved.
Bobby, the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is warning this is really just the beginning and says there will be more casualties. Let's listen.
The president's been right to say there will be casualties. Things like this don't happen without casualties. There will be more casualties. And no one is, especially our generation knows what it's like to see Americans come home in caskets. But that doesn't weaken us one bit. It stiffens our spine and our resolve to say this is a fight we will finish.
And he didn't rule out American boots on the ground. Just in the last few days, we've seen more casualties. Israel reporting first members of its military killed in this war happened in Lebanon. There were civilians lost in Saudi Arabia. And of course, hundreds of people, innocent civilians killed in Iran through all of this. What's your sense of how all this is unfolding in the region? Comments like that from Hegseth, how that's received?
Well, we've already seen mission creep take place, right? This was meant to be, if you go back some weeks, this was meant to be, President Trump's first stated objective was to help the protesters in Iran. Then it became about regime change. First, it was going to be just a matter of a few days of bombing from the air, and then it would be all done. Now we're talking about weeks, possibly months. And not just Hegseth, others have refused to rule out putting boots on the ground. This is classic mission creep. We've seen this play out again and again and again. And the trouble is, it's okay to say that, look, when you're in a war, soldiers will die. This is unambiguously true. But usually when you go into a war, you communicate clearly to your people why it is their sons and daughters in the armed forces are going to make the sacrifice. Why is it that we're at war with this country, and why now? It's not enough to say that, well, the Iranian regime are bad guys. They've been bad guys for a very long time. And just last year, the Israelis, with our help, bombed, as the president said, obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities. Now you're saying we're going back to war with the same country. You have not explained to the American people why it is we are at war. So when American soldiers pay the ultimate price and come home in caskets, it is completely reasonable for Americans to ask, what's going on here? Why are our boys and girls being put to this ultimate sacrifice? That's a reasonable question to ask, and the administration has not answered it.